The snow was falling in thick, trembling sheets when Elena knelt beside the girl in the wheelchair, lifting a small, steaming cup of soup toward her trembling hands and whispering, "You're safe now," as the Christmas lights behind them glowed softly through the storm. The girl's breath quivered in pale clouds, her lips barely parting as she tried to sip the warmth Eleanor offered. The familiar scent of the cafe's broth drifted into the frozen air, a fragile promise of comfort against the unforgiving night. Across the street, a solitary man watched in silence, blurred by snowfall and distance, unable or unwilling to step forward. And in that suspended instant, before any of them grasped the weight of this encounter, the world seemed to pause around them. Inside the cafe, the heat rose softly, curling against the windows as if trying to keep the blizzard outside. Elena guided the girl toward the small portable stove where they kept pies warm, watching the tension slowly drain from her tiny shoulders with each careful sip of soup. There was a tremble in the child's hands that spoke of more than cold, something learned and ingrained. Elena approached her gently, afraid to disturb whatever fragile peace had just formed. The snowfall outside muffled everything, turning the cafe into a quiet cocoon. As the warmth settled, Elena's mind stirred in uneasy circles. Questions pressed at her, but she knew instinctively that silence was the only bridge toward trust. The girl wiped her tears in quick, practiced motions, as if hiding emotions was a survival skill she had mastered too early. No adult had appeared in her wake, no voice calling her name from the street. That absence echoed louder than the wind outside. The city beyond the windows was a blur of ice and drifting headlights, swallowed by the white curtain of the storm. Chicago could be cruel in December, especially on a Christmas Eve like this, where the cold felt more like a warning than a season. Eleanor stared at the door marked by the girl's faint footprints, imagining the path she must have taken through the freezing dark. Something about this night felt orchestrated in a way she didn't yet understand. And a quiet dread whispered that this was only the beginning. The girl glanced at her with a hesitant, almost apologetic look, as though asking permission simply to exist in the warm glow of the cafe. Elena smiled, summoning a calm she didn't fully feel, and pulled a chair close so she could sit beside her. The cafe, usually silent at closing time, now felt strangely alive, as if responding to the fragile rescue it had just witnessed. The child adjusted the blanket over her legs and avoided any memory of the cold. Something in her posture suggested she was used to bracing for disappointment. The storm thickened, coating the world outside in a deepening silence. Eleanor thought briefly about her own life, the relentless shifts, the mounting bills, the long nights spent too tired to truly see anyone. Yet here she sat, eyes fixed on a child who seemed carved from loneliness. It wasn't that the girl looked lost. She looked abandoned by circumstance itself. The realization carved through Elena with unexpected force. Perhaps destiny had chosen this exact moment for them both. A sudden gust rattled the glass door, and Elena felt the uncanny certainty that someone was near. She lifted her gaze, but saw only the swirling snow and faint street lamps flickering like warnings. The girl reacted before she did, shrinking slightly in her seat, anxiety threading through her small movements. Elena reached out, placing her hand over the child's as a quiet promise of safety. She told her they were all right here, even though she wasn't sure from whom they were hiding. Gradually, an almost sacred hush drifted through the cafe, as if the building itself exhaled beside them. Elena remembered winters from her own childhood, nights when her mother's hot chocolate chased away the shadows. For a heartbeat, she wished she could lend such memories to the child beside her. Something in the girl's solemn, watchful face told her that fear had lived with her far too long. Warmth, she realized, needed to reach deeper than the skin tonight. Time softened around them, until the girl asked, with a voice barely above her breath, if she could stay just a little longer. Elena said yes without hesitation, feeling the weight lift from the child as though she'd been waiting days to hear that single word. The flickering lamp on the counter cast gentle moving shapes along the walls, making the cafe glow with something close to magic. The storm raged on outside, unforgiving and vast, but here, in this small pocket of warmth, something tender had begun. Then Eleanor heard a sound from outside, different from the wind, more deliberate and human. The girl stiffened instantly, as if recognizing the footsteps long before they reached the door. A figure began to form beyond the frosted glass, tall and heavy in the swirling snow. Elena's pulse quickened, sensing the fragile piece shatter before her eyes. Because warmth could protect a child from the cold, but not from the truth that was now walking toward them. Inside the cafe, the door clicked shut behind them, sealing out the storm with a muffled thud that made the room feel strangely hollow. Elena guided the girl toward a small booth, watching how the child's shoulders curled inward as if expecting the world to fall apart around her. The warm lights reflected softly on her pale cheeks, still damp from the cold. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply breathed in the same fragile rhythm. And the quiet that settled there felt deeper than the snow outside. Elena moved behind the counter, letting habit guide her hands as she poured hot chocolate into a mug, the steam rising in gentle coils. She wasn't sure why her own fingers trembled slightly, maybe from the cold, maybe from everything unsaid. The clink of ceramic against the counter echoed in the empty cafe, as if the place itself were listening. She glanced at the girl who was following her every motion with wary eyes. It was the look of someone who didn't know where safety truly began. When Elena returned with the mug, the girl accepted it with both hands, as though it was something sacred. The heat seeped slowly into her palms, and a faint shiver slipped down her arms, like the last echo of fear escaping her body. Eleanor watched her sip carefully, almost apologetically, as if she believed she was taking something she didn't deserve. The silence between them stretched thin, but not uncomfortable. It felt like a space waiting to be filled. The girl's breathing steadied, but her eyes moved nervously toward the window, as if searching for a familiar shadow. Snow drifted past the glass in slow, hypnotic spirals, obscuring anything that might have been lurking outside. Elena wondered who the man watching earlier had been, the one who had lingered across the street under the snowfall. Something about his presence had felt heavy, not threatening, but charged with meaning. And a part of her feared the meaning wasn't good. Elena leaned back slightly, studying the girl's posture, how her fingers tightened around the mug whenever the wind howled against the door. Children didn't tremble like that without a reason. She thought of all the lost souls who wandered in during hard winters, seeking warmth for a night. But this girl wasn't wandering. She looked like she had been pushed out into the cold by something that wasn't chance. And the thought made Elena's chest tighten with a protective ache. The cafe lights flickered for a brief moment, a tiny pulse of electricity that brought Elena back to the present. The girl's eyes widened, as if the small flicker were a sign of something dark returning. Elena quickly reassured her with a soft nod, though she wasn't sure the child believed her. The storm continued to rage outside, the kind that swallowed sound and logic. It made the cafe feel like an island, floating in a world of white and uncertainty, and Eleanor knew islands had a way of attracting shipwrecks. She sat down across from the girl, resting her forearms on the table, giving space, but also presence. The child stared into the steam that rose from her cup as if reading a story only she could see. Eleanor didn't press her with questions. She let the moment breathe. She felt that any wrong word would cause the fragile piece to crumble. And so she simply waited, matching her breathing to the child's, hoping patience would be enough. Eventually, the girl whispered something so faint Eleanor almost missed it, a small thread of sound woven between the ticking of the wall clock. Her voice carried a tremor, the kind that came from holding too many secrets for too long. Elena leaned forward, not to demand, but to invite. The girl's gaze drifted up for a heartbeat before falling again. And whatever she had tried to say dissolved in the warmth of the cup she clutched. Elena looked toward the window once more, wondering if the man was still out there, hidden behind the storm's thick curtain. She sensed a tension lingering in the air, as if the cafe had become a place where two separate worlds were beginning to converge. Something told her this night was not an accident, that their meeting belonged to a chain of events already set in motion. And yet she felt powerless to predict what came next. When she turned back to the girl, there was a new expression on the child's face, something between fear and a plea for understanding. Elena felt the weight of it, like a stone settling in her stomach. She reached out gently, letting her hand rest on the table where the girl could choose to meet it or not. And in that quiet, delicate gesture, a question began to take shape, not spoken but unmistakably present. What had this child endured before the snow carried her to Elena's door? Elena awoke early, as she always did, long before the city decided to stretch and breathe, and the apartment around her seemed to sigh under the weight of another winter morning. Her small radiator hummed with a tired persistence, puffing out warmth that never quite reached the corners of the room. She stood in the dim light, brushing back her dark hair as she gazed at the cracked window pane, watching the sky shift from charcoal to silver. For years, this had been her rhythm: rise quietly, work steadily, dream rarely. And for the most part, the world never asked anything different of her. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds from the night before, a scent that clung to her hands no matter how much she washed them. She brewed a fresh pot as though it were an anchor, something stable in a life that felt fragile in too many places. Bills waited in a pile near the bread box, folded neatly but heavy with unspoken warnings. She sipped the first bitter mouthful and felt reality settle into her bones, the way it always did before sunrise. It was a life of repetition, but repetition had a quiet kind of safety. As she dressed for work, she moved around the apartment with practiced efficiency, choosing layers thick enough to battle the cold, yet thin enough to maneuver through a long shift. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired but not defeated, a softness in her eyes still refusing to fade despite the world's best efforts. On the kitchen table lay an old photograph of her mother in a summer dress, smiling as if joy were the most natural state of being. Elena touched the picture lightly, remembering how that smile had sustained her during darker years. Even now, it felt like a lantern guiding her through the fog. Her mother called every night, usually after dinner, her voice warm despite the distance and age that weighed on her. They spoke about simple things: weather, recipes, an old novella the mother still insisted on rewatching. Elena cherished those conversations more than she admitted to anyone, because they grounded her, tethered her to a sense of belonging she otherwise lacked. She promised herself she would visit soon, though she'd made that promise more times than she could count. Life always seemed to rearrange her intentions. The walk to work was normally peaceful, but that morning felt heavier, the air biting with a cruel sharpness. Snow cracked beneath her boots, echoing through the quiet streets as she passed darkened storefronts and shuttered apartments. She pulled her scarf tighter, watching her breath drift into the frozen dawn like faint smoke. Despite the cold, she found comfort in the city's early stillness, a moment when everything felt clean and untouched. But somewhere beneath her ribs, a flicker of unease pulsed. When she reached the cafe, she flipped on the lights and set the chairs down with a quiet determination, creating order from the emptiness. The walls glowed softly, reflecting the garlands she had hung earlier in the week, hoping they would bring at least a little brightness to strangers. She wiped the counters, warmed the ovens, arranged the pastries, movements familiar enough to dull any wandering thoughts. But today, her mind drifted back to the girl in the snow. Something about her trembling hands refused to leave Elena's memory. Customers trickled in as the morning grew, bundled tightly in coats and carrying the hurried energy of last-minute errands. Elena greeted each one with her usual warmth. Though something about her smile felt stretched thin, she moved through the motions, but the girl's pale face lingered behind every interaction. In the tilt of a stranger's head, she imagined fear. In the hush of the wind at the door, she imagined footsteps that didn't belong. It was as though the previous night had awakened a part of her she had kept asleep. During her break, she sat at the staff table in the back, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The girl's silence replayed in her mind, a silence heavy with things unsaid. Elena felt the urge to protect her rise again, inexplicable, yet fierce. She wondered what the child was doing now, whether she was warm, safe, or still trembling somewhere beneath the storm. The thought unsettled her in ways she couldn't name, and she knew this feeling wasn't going anywhere. As the shift neared its end, Elena closed her locker and reached for her coat, her mind drifting back through years of small sacrifices and quiet resignations. She had always told herself that life didn't need to be extraordinary to matter, that kindness in small moments was enough. But something in her heart disagreed now, whispering that she had stepped onto a path she couldn't step back from, a path that felt both frightening and strangely right. She pulled her scarf tight, preparing to face the cold again. Just as she reached for the cafe's front door, her foot brushed against something small that clinked softly on the floor. She bent down and picked it up, expecting a stray coin or a dropped key, but what she held in her palm was neither. It was delicate, expensive, unmistakably out of place in her simple world. And as she turned it over, a chilling realization spread through her. It belonged to the girl from the storm. The morning after the storm carried a strange stillness, one that felt too deliberate to be natural. Elena pulled the cafe's key from her pocket and unlocked the door, her mind still circling the delicate object she had found the night before. She kept it tucked in a small cloth inside her apron, as though it might vanish if handled too freely. She didn't know why she had kept it, only that something about it felt important. And that importance unsettled her in quiet, persistent ways. The cafe warmed slowly as she prepared for the day, filling with scents of cinnamon and fresh pastry dough. She tried to focus on the familiar routine, but her thoughts kept drifting toward the girl's pale, frightened eyes. Every few minutes, she felt an invisible thread tug at her chest, a pull she couldn't name. She told herself to breathe, to let the morning be just another morning, but deep down, she already knew that wasn't possible. Something had broken open inside her. She was wiping the counter when the door chimed behind her, a subtle sound that made her look up with the gentle expectation of a regular customer. But the man who stepped inside didn't move, like someone searching for coffee or warmth. He filled the space, slowly, deliberately, as though measuring every inch of the room. His presence arrived before he did. His silence pressed against the walls, and for a moment, Elena forgot to breathe. He was older than she expected, tall with a sharpness in his posture that suggested a lifetime spent commanding rooms far larger than this one. Snow still clung to the shoulders of his dark coat, melting slowly onto the floor. His eyes swept the cafe with a clinical precision, but when they settled on her, something colder flickered behind them. Eleanor felt the urge to step back but held her ground. The air between them grew taut, thin as glass. He approached the counter without speaking, and the closer he got, the heavier the room felt. Elena noticed the faint tremor in his jaw, not of fear, but of someone holding too much emotion in too small a space. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed, yet beneath that authority lay something quieter, something that almost resembled desperation. And it was that softer note that made Elena's pulse quicken in an unfamiliar way. He asked about a child, not by name, not with affection, but with a careful precision that made the question sound more like an accusation than concern. Elena felt her heart thump painfully, remembering the girl's trembling hands, the way she had shrunk at the sound of footsteps. Instinct told her to choose her words with caution, though she didn't fully understand why. She answered simply, truthfully, trying to read the man's expression. But he gave her nothing. He repeated the question, this time with a slight shift in tone, as if he were testing her responses rather than seeking information. Elena felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness rise inside her. This was the man from the street, the shadow in the snow. She recognized it in the way he avoided looking toward the booth where the girl had sat the night before. He seemed haunted by something he refused to name. And she felt the storm return, this time inside her chest. As he studied her, his gaze drifted momentarily to the apron at her waist, as though he sensed the presence of the object hidden within it. Elena tightened her posture, unsure why she felt the need to shield it. Her breath clouded faintly in the cold air, leaking through the door, but the warmth of the cafe did little to still her nerves. She sensed that he was the kind of man who rarely heard the word no. And yet, here she was, resisting without speaking a word. The silence stretched until it became its own living thing between them. Elena felt the weight of his expectations pressing against her, but she refused to shrink beneath it. She met his gaze steadily, letting him see that she wouldn't be intimidated. For a flicker of a moment, something like surprise crossed his features, as though he wasn't used to being confronted with quiet strength. And that moment, small as it was, shifted something imperceptible in the room. Then he leaned in just enough for his voice to fall between them like a careful blade, and what he said was not loud, not threatening, but strangely intimate in its certainty. He told her he had seen everything, every gesture, every moment, and he had been watching long before she ever noticed the storm, and Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her, because whatever he meant by that, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't safe. The rest of the day unfolded with a strange heaviness that Elena carried like a shadow through every task. She found herself replaying the conversation with the man, trying to decipher the meaning behind his watchful, unreadable eyes. The cafe hummed with the usual noise of customers, but none of it reached her in the same way. Every voice sounded distant, as though a thin veil had settled between her and the world. And beneath that veil lived an unease she couldn't name. By late morning the snowfall had eased, but the sky remained bruised and colorless, hinting at more storms to come. Elena tried to immerse herself in the comfort of routine, steaming milk, warming pastries, clearing tables. Yet every quiet moment left space for the man's words to echo in her mind. He had seen everything. The phrase clung to her, cold and unwelcome. She wondered whether he had been watching out of concern or scrutiny. She feared the answer leaned toward the latter. Her suspicion grew stronger when a woman entered the cafe shortly after lunch, dressed immaculately in charcoal wool and carrying a leather briefcase. She moved with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than bakeries. Elena greeted her with polite warmth, though her instincts prickled with immediate caution. The woman's gaze swept the cafe in a single calculated glance, then fixed sharply on her, and Elena felt a chill despite the ovens warming the room. The woman introduced herself with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, and asked if they could speak privately. Elena hesitated but motioned toward an empty corner table, feeling the same prickling tension she had felt with the man earlier. The woman sat gracefully, crossing her legs and folding her hands atop the briefcase, as though preparing to deliver a verdict. Something about her presence reminded Elena of winter sunlight, cold, bright, and merciless. And Elena braced herself, sensing the first crack in the calm she had tried to maintain. The questions began subtly, framed as concerns for the child's safety, but they carried an undercurrent of accusation that felt sharp and deliberate. The woman asked where Elena had found the girl, how long she had been with her, whether she had touched her belongings. Each question made Elena's heart tighten, not because she feared guilt, but because the tone implied she should. It was the kind of interrogation dressed in politeness, hiding claws beneath silk, and Elena knew instinctively that honesty alone would not be enough. She answered with calm clarity, but the woman's expression remained unmoved, as though her conclusions had been made before the conversation even began. Elena noticed the slightest curl of her lips whenever she paused, a sign of quiet judgment. The woman took notes, nodding in ways that felt more like dismissals than understanding. And Elena felt her nerves thrum with a low, persistent ache. The cafe, once warm and comforting, now felt too small to contain the tension. When the woman finally closed her briefcase, her smile sharpened with a professional finality that made Elena's stomach sink. She thanked Elena for her cooperation, but the words carried no gratitude, only courtesy. As the woman stood, she glanced pointedly toward the apron where the delicate object rested hidden. It lasted only a second, but the meaning struck Elena with the force of a warning. She felt unprepared, exposed, and as the woman stepped away, a cold certainty settled over her. Rumors began drifting in before the afternoon ended, carried from table to table by customers, with curious eyes and lowered voices. Someone had seen a strange man leaving earlier. Someone else mentioned a child. Another hinted at trouble. Each whisper tightened the knot in Elena's chest. She could feel the narrative slipping away from her hands, reshaped by strangers who knew nothing of the cold or the fear or the fragile trust she had tried to protect. And the hurt settled deeper with every passing hour. By the time her shift ended, Elena felt frayed, her nerves sharply exposed. She locked the cafe doors with trembling fingers, replaying every moment, every word, every loaded glance from the woman. The snowfall had started again, thin and hesitant at first, like ash drifting from a quiet fire. She pulled her coat tight, trying to steady herself against the bite of the wind, but nothing outside felt as cold as the doubt growing inside her. As she stepped into the dim street, a crisp envelope slid from under the cafe door, fluttering at her boots like a wounded bird. She bent down, her breath catching when she saw her name printed neatly across the front. The paper felt heavy in her hands, far heavier than an envelope should, and as she opened it under the flickering streetlight, the first wound of the night revealed itself in elegant, merciless ink. A legal notice. The elevator ride to the upper floors of Armitage Tower felt like ascending into another world, one made of cold steel and sharper expectations. Elena stood rigidly, her reflection multiplied across the mirrored walls, each version of herself looking smaller and more uncertain. She clutched the legal notice in her pocket, feeling its edges dig against her palm, like a reprimand. The silence inside the elevator was thick, the kind that demanded obedience. When the doors slid open, the soft carpet swallowed her footsteps as though warning her to tread lightly. The receptionist greeted her with a professional calm that bordered on indifference, guiding her through a wide corridor lined with glass offices. Everything smelled faintly of expensive cologne and polished metal. Elena felt out of place in her warm cafe coat and well-worn boots, a reminder of a life grounded in service rather than authority. She wondered how a man who operated in a world like this had ever allowed his daughter to wander alone in the winter storm. And the thought sent a quiet burn of anger through her chest. When she entered his office, she was struck by the size of it, a room with walls of glass overlooking the frozen city below. The man stood with his back to her, staring out at the skyline, as though the world outside were a problem only he could solve. He didn't turn immediately, but she sensed the tension in his posture, coiled and controlled. The air inside felt colder than the streets below, and for a moment she questioned whether she should have come at all. When he finally faced her, his expression carried the same stern composure she had seen in the cafe, but beneath it flickered a shadow of something unsteady. He asked her to sit, not with kindness, but with formality. Elena obeyed silently, lowering herself into a chair that felt too elegant for the situation. The man's gaze lingered on her coat, her shoes, her trembling hands. She lifted her chin, refusing to shrink beneath his scrutiny, and in that small gesture the balance between them shifted. He began with pointed questions, similar to those the woman in the cafe had asked, but delivered with far less courtesy. His voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of someone accustomed to absolute control. Elena answered as carefully as she could, yet she felt her frustration rising, pushing against the politeness she had tried so hard to maintain. The man's pride filled the room like a quiet storm, cold and uncompromising, and Elena felt herself resisting it more strongly than she expected. The conversation escalated with each probing inquiry, his questions laced now with a suspicion that stung deeper than any accusation. Eleanor felt her patience fray, her heartbeat hammering in her throat as she tried to hold herself together. She could sense he was fighting something internally too, some guilt or fear he refused to name. But instead of confronting it, he buried it beneath authority. And she wondered how long he had lived this way, trading vulnerability for power. Her voice finally wavered when she told him she had only done what any decent person would have done, nothing more, nothing less. The man paused then, as though her sincerity had struck a nerve. But the moment passed quickly, swallowed by the icy discipline he wore like armor. He turned away from her, staring again at the skyline, and she sensed a war waging inside him, a war he refused to admit existed, and the silence between them grew dangerously sharp. When he faced her again, something new flickered in his expression, something almost like hesitation. He opened a drawer, reached inside, and placed an envelope on the desk. Elena stared at it, unsure of its purpose, but the man didn't explain. Instead, he told her that compensation was the simplest way to resolve misunderstandings. A strange numbness washed over her as she realized he wasn't offering an apology or even gratitude. He was offering money, and something in her chest cracked open. Elena rose slowly, the sting of humiliation burning through her like wildfire. She told him quietly that kindness was not a transaction, nor was decency something to be bought and filed away. Her voice trembled, but her conviction did not. She pushed the envelope back across the desk with trembling fingers, leaving it untouched, unwanted. The man's face tightened, not with anger, but with something wounded and unspoken, and for a moment neither of them knew what to say. As Elena reached the door, ready to leave the coldness of that office behind, the man spoke again, his voice stripped of its certainty. There was something in it, fear, longing, regret, that stopped her steps. But before she could turn back, he swallowed whatever truth had risen, letting silence take its place. And as she walked into the corridor, heart pounding, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't the end of their collision. It was only the moment before the ground finally gave way. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the kind that distorts time and makes every sound feel distant, unreal. Elena walked home with the wind clawing at her coat, replaying every moment from the tower in painful detail. The humiliation clung to her like a second skin, tightening with every breath. She told herself to shake it off, to let it drift away like snow on the sidewalk. But pride, once wounded, had a way of echoing long after the blow. By the time she reached her apartment building, the sky had dimmed into a pale, bruised twilight. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the building itself resisted her return. When she opened her door, the warmth she usually found there felt muted, unable to soothe the ache inside her chest. She dropped her keys onto the table and sank into the nearest chair, her hands still trembling from the weight of that office. And she realized she didn't know how to put herself back together. The apartment held the faint scent of the candle she had left unlit the night before, something soft and floral that normally comforted her. Tonight it felt out of place, like a memory that no longer fit. She tried to settle her thoughts, but they scattered with every attempt, slipping like shards across the floor of her mind. The envelope he had offered her haunted her more than the legal notice ever could. Money as a solution, money as erasure. She felt the sting of it every time she closed her eyes. She leaned back and stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks that mapped themselves like faint lightning above her head. She had grown accustomed to hardship, but this felt different, more personal, more violating. It wasn't just her integrity that had been questioned, it was her humanity. She remembered the girl's trembling hands, the way she had clung to warmth as though it might disappear. And Elena wondered how a man who carried so much power could fail to understand something so simple. Kindness was not currency. The room felt unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every heartbeat. She tried to distract herself by tidying, folding blankets, rearranging the books on her shelf, but nothing settled the storm inside her. Her thoughts always returned to the same point. The girl had trusted her. And now Elena feared she might never see her again, that the cold world beyond her apartment had swallowed her whole. The idea tightened her throat with a grief she hadn't expected. As evening deepened, Elena made herself tea, though she barely tasted it. She stood by the window, looking out at the city lights flickering beneath the falling snow. Each flake drifted down like a quiet reminder of the night they had met. She wondered if the girl was somewhere warm, or if she still trembled under the weight of fear. The wind pressed against the glass in long, mournful sighs. And Eleanor felt the crushing helplessness of someone who cared too deeply without knowing how to help. Her thoughts spiraled until she felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, uninvited and unwelcome. She wiped them away quickly, ashamed of her own vulnerability. Pride had kept her standing for years, holding her together when life chipped away at the edges, but tonight she felt that pride cracking, strained thin by forces she couldn't control. She wasn't angry at the girl or even the man. She was angry at the world that made simple compassion feel like a crime, and she wondered how much more she could endure. She turned away from the window, ready to force herself into sleep just to escape her thoughts, when a faint sound drifted from the hallway outside. It was soft, hesitant, like something brushing against the floor. Elena froze, listening, unsure if it was her imagination or something real. The wind faded for a moment, giving the building a rare pocket of silence, and in that stillness the sound came again. Closer this time. A quiet scrape, a whisper of motion. Her heartbeat quickened, confusion mingling with dread as she approached the door. She hesitated with her hand on the knob, listening one last time before pulling it open. The hallway lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the floorboards. At first, she saw nothing. Then her gaze dropped lower toward the cold tiles just beyond her threshold. Her breath caught in her throat, suspended in a moment that didn't feel entirely real. There, shivering beneath the dim glow of the hallway light, sat the girl in the wheelchair, alone, trembling, and waiting for someone to find her again. Elena knelt in the hallway, her breath catching as she took in the sight of the girl, shivering beneath the thin light. The child's lips were pale, her eyes wide with exhaustion, as though the journey to this door had taken everything she had. Snow clung to her hair in tiny crystals that sparkled like broken stars. Elena felt her heart twist in a mix of fear and fierce protectiveness. Without a second thought, she guided the girl gently inside. The warmth of the apartment enveloped them with a soft, fragile embrace, though it did little to erase the child's trembling. Elena hurried to wrap a blanket around her shoulders, her hands moving faster than her thoughts. Questions flooded her mind, all clashing for space, but she held them back, knowing they could wait. The girl looked around as if trying to understand the concept of safety in a real place, and Elena could only hope her small home offered that. She wheeled the girl closer to the radiator, watching as the heat slowly reached her cheeks, returning a faint blush of life. The silence between them was thick, full of things unsaid, full of shadows that slipped in through the edges of memory. The girl clutched the blanket tightly, her knuckles pale with tension. Elena sat beside her, close enough to reassure, far enough not to overwhelm, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all. When the girl finally lifted her eyes, there was something fractured in them, something that told of nights far colder than this one. Eleanor felt the heaviness of it settle into her own chest, a weight she didn't know how to hold yet refused to ignore. She asked if the girl was hurt, her voice barely above a whisper. The child shook her head, although her eyes told a different story, a story she wasn't ready to share, and Elena didn't press her. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the snowy distance, their haunting cry echoing through the narrow street below. The city felt restless, shifting beneath the storm like a creature trying to escape its own skin. Elena wondered if someone was looking for the child, if danger lurked closer than she dared imagine. The thought sent a quiet shiver down her spine. She leaned toward the window, parting the curtain just enough to check the street. Nothing moved but the snow. The girl flinched at the sound of a gust of wind against the glass, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Elena turned back to her, offering a soft smile meant to soothe, though she wasn't sure it succeeded. It struck her how instinctive the child's fear seemed, not the fear of getting lost, but the fear of being found. And that realization hollowed something inside her. She wondered what kind of life taught a child to fear footsteps more than loneliness. She brewed tea, the scent of chamomile filling the air like a quiet reassurance, hoping its warmth would reach the girl, even if words could not. When she returned, the child was watching her with an expression almost too old for her small face. Elena set the cup beside her, letting the steam drift gently upward. The girl wrapped her hands around it slowly, as if testing whether the comfort offered was real. Elena felt her heart break in slow, quiet pieces. They sat together in the soft hum of the apartment, the radiator clicking rhythmically like a heartbeat, trying to keep steady. Elena wanted to ask so much, why she had come, who had let her out into the cold, why she looked as though she carried the weight of someone else's mistakes. But she held the questions behind her teeth, keeping the night tender and safe. The girl leaned slightly toward her, the smallest surrender of trust. And that was enough. After a long stretch of silence, the girl swallowed hard, her eyes drifting up with a quiet vulnerability that hit Elena like a blow. Her voice emerged fragile and thin, as though each syllable cost her something. She asked if she had done something wrong, if she was allowed to be here. Elena felt the ache of that question unravel through her chest, unraveling years of her own unspoken loneliness. She told the child gently that she had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. The girl's eyes shimmered, reflecting the glow of the living room lamp like tiny pools of uncertainty. She hesitated, drawing a slow breath that trembled at the edges, and looked around the room as if memorizing every shadow. Her hands tightened on the blanket, gathering courage from somewhere deep and quiet. And when she finally found her voice again, it carried a question so small and yet so devastating in its softness. "Can I stay?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She let the moment breathe, letting the girl's questions settle into the room with a tenderness that felt both fragile and sacred. The child sat perfectly still, waiting as though bracing for disappointment, her small hands twisting the blanket with slow, nervous movements. Elena leaned closer, searching the girl's eyes for the truth buried inside them. She saw longing, fear, and something else. Hope, faint but alive. And she knew she couldn't let that hope die here. She told the girl she could stay for now, that no one would take her back out into the cold tonight, and watched the tension melt from her tiny shoulders. The child exhaled a soft, trembling breath, as though she had been holding it for hours, maybe days. Elena felt something warm unfurl inside her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She adjusted the blanket around the girl more securely, wanting her to feel anchored. And for the first time that night, the apartment no longer felt too small. Still, Elena knew she couldn't face this alone. The world was too sharp, too complicated, for her to navigate it blindly. She reached for her phone with steady hands, scrolling through contacts until she found the name she trusted most, Marcy, a long-time friend who worked as a pediatric nurse. Marcy always spoke with a calm that seemed woven from compassion itself. Eleanor hesitated only a second before pressing call. And as the phone rang, she prayed the girl wouldn't sense her worry. When Marcy answered, her voice warm and familiar, Eleanor felt her throat tighten with relief. She explained as much as she could without frightening the child, lowering her voice to a gentle murmur. Marcy listened intently, pausing only to ask quiet, careful questions. It felt like being handed a rope in a blizzard. When she finally spoke again, her tone carried reassurance Eleanor desperately needed. She promised to come over as soon as she could, and that promise steadied the trembling corners of the night. Elena hung up and returned to the girl, who was watching her with wide, alert eyes, as though trying to understand whether the phone call had changed her fate. Eleanor knelt beside her and assured her softly that she wasn't alone anymore. Not tonight, not in this home. The child's lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile, something so faint it nearly broke Elena's heart with its tenderness. She brushed a loose strand of hair from the girl's forehead, and for a brief moment the room felt bathed in a warmth untouched by winter. The kettle clicked off behind them, filling the air with the gentle hiss of steam. Eleanor poured a fresh cup of tea for herself, needing the warmth as much as the girl did. She sat nearby, watching the child relax inch by inch, her breathing deepening as the room wrapped around her like a shelter. The soft glow of the lamp painted golden edges on everything it touched, and Elena marveled at how hope could enter a place so quietly, like light filtering through frost. They spent several minutes in peaceful silence, broken only by the hum of the radiator and the occasional shifting of the blanket. The girl seemed calmer now, her eyes drifting around the apartment with cautious curiosity. Elena felt an unfamiliar sense of belonging begin to bloom between them, delicate yet unmistakable. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight felt like a small victory against whatever shadows followed the child, and that felt meaningful in a way she hadn't expected. A sudden laugh from the street below drifted through the window, muffled by snow, reminding them that life continued outside their small refuge. Elena glanced out and saw two strangers walking under an umbrella, their silhouettes softened by falling flakes. The peaceful sight grounded her, reminding her that hope often appeared in quiet, unremarkable moments. She turned back to the girl, who had noticed her gaze and leaned slightly closer. And for the first time, they shared a silence that felt almost gentle, just as Elena began to ask if the girl wanted anything else, another blanket, tea, or simply company. The child's head tilted slightly, her expression shifting into something wary. She glanced toward the front door with a sudden stiffness, as though she felt the world lean in again. Elena followed her gaze, sensing a subtle shift in the air, a tremor of anticipation she couldn't quite place. Outside, the wind howled low, almost like a warning whispered through the cracks, and then a knock. Soft, measured, unexpected. A sound that shattered the fragile peace like a single drop onto still water. Elena froze at the sound, her breath caught in the narrow space between fear and instinct. The girl tightened her grip on the blanket, shrinking slightly into the chair as if bracing for something familiar and unwelcome. The knock came again, soft but deliberate, as though the person on the other side already knew what waited within. Elena steadied herself and crossed the room with careful steps. When she opened the door, the cold swept in like a warning. And standing beneath the dim hallway light was the man from the storm. He looked different here, stripped of the distance that snow had once offered him. His dark coat clung to him, damp from the walk, and his eyes carried a depth she hadn't seen before, something raw, something unraveling. He didn't speak at first, his gaze flicking past her into the apartment, searching for a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to find. Elena stood firm, blocking his path with a quiet resolve. The air between them pulsed with tension, thick and unspoken, and she sensed the storm outside had followed him in spirit. He finally stepped in, but not closer. Instead, he held himself with a restrained rigidity, as though afraid of what proximity might reveal. His voice, when it came, was softer than she expected, worn thin around the edges. It held the weight of sleepless nights and 1,000 unasked questions. Elena listened, but didn't answer immediately, choosing silence over confrontation. The girl behind her shifted slightly, the sound small but unmistakable. And that tiny movement made the man's breath falter. Elena could feel the ache in the girl's silence, her hesitation pressing against the room like frost on glass. She stepped aside just enough for the man to see the child clearly. His posture, once rigid with control, dissolved into something far more fragile as his eyes fell upon her. A softness broke through the iron lines of his face, a grief he seemed desperate to swallow. And in that moment, Elena realized that whatever else he was a father drowning in regret. The man took a tentative step forward, then stopped as though something invisible held him back. His hands shook, not violently, but with the kind of tremor born from truths avoided for too long. The girl watched him with wide eyes, not fearful now, but uncertain, waiting for him to choose a version of himself. Elena saw the man struggle with words, clawing through layers of pride and guilt to find something true. But words seemed too heavy, too slow, and for now, silence did the speaking. He pressed a hand to his forehead, exhaling a breath that sounded like surrender. He admitted he had lost sight of his daughter for more than a moment, that he had misjudged the storm, misjudged the world, misjudged himself. His voice cracked on the edges of the confession, splintering under the weight of honesty. Elena felt her heart soften despite herself, despite the wounds he had caused, because beneath the polished exterior she saw a man grieving the father he had meant to be. The girl's eyes shimmered at the sound of his voice, a hesitant recognition stirring within her. She shifted forward slightly in her chair, and the movement, subtle as it was, seemed to break something open in him. He reached out instinctively, then stopped himself, as though unsure he had the right. The conflict in his face was unmistakable. Love fighting shame, hope fighting fear. Elena saw it all, and for a moment she felt the weight of all three hearts beating inside the room. He turned toward her then, as though searching for permission in her gaze, in her quiet strength, in the compassion she had shown his daughter when he had failed to. Elena met his eyes, steady and unyielding, offering neither condemnation nor absolution. Instead, she offered presence. Something in him softened under that gaze, like ice cracking under unexpected warmth, and his shoulders sagged with the gravity of truths he could no longer outrun. He stepped closer to the child, just enough for his voice to reach her without trembling too much. He spoke her name slowly, reverently, as though it were the first prayer he had uttered in years. The girl blinked, tears welling, her small hand twitching beneath the blanket. Elena felt the shift in the air, the delicate bridge forming between them, and she understood, with a quiet ache, that this moment would shape all the moments to come. Then he turned toward Elena once more, his voice falling into a whisper, heavy with desperation. His pride stripped away, his authority hollowed by fear. He spoke with the honesty of a man who no longer knew how to fix what he had broken. He said he couldn't do this alone. He said he didn't know how to reach his own daughter. And he begged her, gently, almost humbly, for help. He needed her, desperately. The weight of the man's confession lingered in the air, settling over the small apartment like a shadow that had finally stopped pretending it wasn't there. Elena watched him struggle for words, his hands trembling slightly, as though each memory carried its own frostbite. He paced once, then stopped near the window, staring into the snow-streaked night as if searching for something he had long lost. The girl remained still, her gaze fixed on him with a fragile mixture of longing and caution. And Elena knew the truth he had given them was only the beginning. He finally spoke again, his voice low and uneven, admitting that he had not lost sight of his daughter for minutes, as he previously implied, but for hours. His schedule, his meetings, his endless responsibilities, one piled on top of another, until he convinced himself she was safe enough without him. Elena felt the ache of that admission ripple through the room, raw and unvarnished. She watched the girl's eyes flicker, absorbing every syllable with trembling understanding, and she realized the truth was cutting in both directions. He confessed that he had trusted someone else to watch her, someone he believed capable, someone he paid handsomely to keep his daughter safe. But they had failed him, and he had failed her by not seeing the warning signs sooner. His voice broke slightly on the word regret, as though it were a foreign language he was only now learning to speak. Elena saw his shoulders sag under the strain of his own honesty, and for the first time she felt the depth of his desperation. The girl's breathing grew quiet and shallow, each inhale tight with emotion. Elena sensed that she was holding something inside, something that sat heavy in her chest like a stone she wasn't ready to lift. She moved closer to her, offering silent reassurance. The child looked up, her expression flickering with fear, and something deeper, something shaped by memories too heavy for her small frame. And Elena braced herself instinctively, sensing the moment had arrived for truths long buried. The father turned back toward them, his face pale beneath the soft amber light. He admitted he had seen the footage from the security cameras, the stark images of his daughter alone in the storm. He had watched it again and again, punishing himself with every frame. He whispered that he didn't know when she had slipped out or why she hadn't been stopped. Elena saw the grief twisting inside him, a grief that gnawed through layers of pride and certainty, and she felt her own walls soften despite the pain he had caused. He took a step closer to his daughter, his eyes pleading not for forgiveness, but for understanding. He told her he should have been there, that he should have never allowed her to feel alone in a world so cold. The girl looked at him, and something in her expression wavered, as though an invisible thread between them had frayed but not snapped. Elena sensed the fragile connection, uncertain yet alive, and she felt the tension of a wound that needed truth to heal. Elena gently encouraged the girl to speak if she could, reminding her softly that she was safe here, tonight, in this small room, away from the biting wind. The girl swallowed hard, her gaze drifting to the window as though replaying a memory only she could see. She rubbed her hands together, more out of nerves than cold, and when she finally looked up again, her eyes shimmered with a vulnerability that struck Elena's heart like a quiet blow. She braced herself for something she wasn't sure she was ready for. The girl shifted slightly in her chair, her fingers tightening around the blanket with an urgency that betrayed her calm exterior. She inhaled, slow and shaky, gathering the courage to lift the words from the place where she had buried them. Elena leaned in, her breath held in, waiting. The father remained frozen in place, fear slicing through the rigid posture he had worked so hard to maintain. And in that fragile pause, the room felt suspended between two heartbeats. Her voice finally emerged, small and thin, but sharp with truth. She said she hadn't gone outside to run away or to explore or to wait for someone. She said she had left because she thought someone was coming back for her, someone who had promised they would, someone who didn't. Elena felt something tighten deep inside her chest at those words. And the father staggered slightly, as though struck by a blow he hadn't anticipated. Then the girl lifted her gaze fully, tears gathering at the edges, and whispered the truth that fractured the night. She hadn't been out there by accident. She had been left there, on purpose, by someone she trusted and not by her father. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, curling slowly around them, refusing to fade. Elena felt the weight of it settle against her skin, chilling her far more than the winter storm ever had. The father took a step back, his expression collapsing in on itself, confusion and horror battling for dominance. The girl's breathing grew unsteady, her fingers trembling where they clutched the blanket, and the room, once warm with fragile hope, now felt colder than the night outside. Elena moved instinctively toward the girl, as though a shield had risen within her. She placed a hand on the child's arm, grounding her in the moment, reminding her silently that she was not alone. The father watched with a hollow gaze, as though witnessing a truth that shattered the story he had been telling himself. He asked who had done it, but the question felt too large, too heavy, as though it demanded more than the child could give. Elena's heart ached at the sight of her struggle. The girl opened her mouth, then closed it again, her lips tightening around a memory she was afraid to release. Eleanor spoke to her softly, assuring her that she didn't need to share everything at once. The child's eyes flickered with gratitude, but also fear, the kind that comes from betrayal too deep for words. The father's posture stiffened, his hands curling slightly at his sides as he tried to steady himself. And Elena realized he was no longer battling her. He was battling himself. Silence thickened between them, a silence filled with jagged edges. Elena turned toward the man, meeting his gaze with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. She told him the girl needed time, not pressure. He inhaled sharply, as though the words stung, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded slowly, the motion weighted with shame. Eleanor sensed a shift then, subtle but real, the beginning of something more honest between them. But honesty, she knew, was only the first step. The father moved closer, careful not to startle the girl, his voice dropping into something quiet and raw. He admitted he had trusted someone he shouldn't have, someone who had been with his family for years. Elena saw the dawning realization spread through him like a painful light. He asked the girl again, this time with gentleness instead of fear, if she could tell him anything at all. The child looked at him with trembling uncertainty. And for a moment, Elena wondered if trust could be rebuilt from so much brokenness. The girl whispered a name. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough for the father to turn pale. He staggered slightly, steadying himself on the edge of the table, his eyes widening with a grief so deep it seemed to hollow out the room. Elena didn't know the name, but she recognized the devastation it caused. The father pressed a hand to his chest, as if trying to hold himself together. And she felt her own breath catch at the sight of a man unraveling at the seams. Elena stepped forward, her voice low but unwavering. She told him the girl wasn't safe in that home, not with people he didn't fully know, not with trust that had been misplaced once already. The words struck him with a clarity that sharpened the grief in his eyes. He nodded slowly, as though the truth were a weight he had no choice but to carry. The girl watched him with trembling hope, uncertain if he could be the father she needed, and Elena felt the fragile spark of something shifting in him. The room grew smaller as the moment tightened around them. The father's breathing uneven, the girl's fear rising, Elena standing between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. She realized then that the confrontation wasn't between her and him. It was between the man he had been and the man he needed to become. She told him, gently but firmly, that he had to choose who he was from this moment onward. His eyes burned with unshed tears, the edges of his composure crumbling. He sank into the chair opposite his daughter, his posture no longer proud or cold, but undone. He told Elena he didn't know how to begin again, how to fix what had been broken. His voice trembled, the words slipping from a place he had guarded for too long. Elena felt a tug of compassion, deep and unexpected, pulling at her ribs. She knew he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for direction, and that was something she could offer. With a slow, steady breath, Elena reminded him that healing required presence, not perfection. That the girl didn't need grandeur or promises. She needed truth, consistency, and someone who could stand beside her without faltering. The father bowed his head, absorbing her words as though they were the first honest guidance he had received in years. The girl watched him carefully, her eyes shining with cautious wonder, and Elena felt the air change, softening just enough for hope to slip back inside. Then the father lifted his gaze, his voice barely holding together, and asked Elena the question she had feared and expected in equal measure. He asked her to stay involved, to help him rebuild the connection he had broken, not as a replacement, not as a savior, but as someone who knew how to reach his daughter in ways he had forgotten. He told her he couldn't do it alone, not anymore, and the vulnerability in his eyes made the room fall into a hush so deep it felt sacred. Elena felt the weight of his request settle on her shoulders, heavier than anything she had carried in years. She looked at the girl, who gazed back with a hope so delicate it threatened to break her heart. She looked at the man, whose fear and honesty mingled in equal measure. And in that suspended moment, she understood that whatever she chose next would shape all of their lives. The night waited, silent and breathless, for her answer. But before she could speak, before she could even gather the courage to form a word, the girl whispered something that shattered every certainty in the room. "Please, don't leave." And the world held still, waiting for what Elena would do. The child's plea lingered in the room with a trembling sincerity that made Elena's heart tighten. She felt the pull of the words, the small but fierce hope behind them, and she knew she couldn't step back now. She moved closer, kneeling beside the girl, letting her presence speak before her voice did. The father watched helplessly, fear and gratitude colliding in his eyes. Elena placed her hand gently over the girl's, and in that simple gesture, something within all three of them shifted. She told the girl she wasn't going anywhere, not tonight, not while fear still shadowed her small shoulders. Relief washed over the child's face, softening its lines in a way that made her look younger, almost weightless. Elena saw the father exhale, as though releasing a breath he had held for years. He sat down quietly, not imposing himself, just listening, absorbing the fragile moment unfolding before him. The room warmed with a tenderness unspoken, but deeply felt. And the night no longer felt so unforgiving. Elena suggested they talk together, only if the girl felt ready, and the father nodded with a humility that felt new. The child hesitated, then whispered pieces of her story, small fragments shaped by fear and confusion. She spoke of promises broken, of waiting in the cold for someone who never returned. Her voice wavered, trembling like a candle in wind. Elena listened without interruption. And the father listened, as though every word carved a path back to his daughter's heart. The man's expression softened with each truth revealed, grief etching itself into the corners of his face. He offered quiet apologies, not dramatic or rehearsed, but raw and genuine, spoken from a place he had kept locked away. The girl blinked through tears, absorbing the sound of a father trying. Elena felt the distance between them shrink, bit by bit. And she realized that healing sometimes began with small, trembling syllables, words that had waited too long to be spoken. A cautious warmth began to settle around them, fragile but real. The girl leaned slightly toward her father, and Eleanor saw him freeze, afraid to move, afraid to shatter the moment. Encouraged, the child reached out her hand. The father met it through his own tears, his fingers folding around hers with a reverence that bordered on disbelief. Elena felt her chest tighten at the sight, and she knew she was witnessing the beginning of something redemptive. They talked for what felt like hours, though time moved strangely, suspended between pain and possibility. Elena guided the conversation gently, bridging gaps neither of them knew how to cross alone. The father asked what he could do, truly do, to make things right. The girl didn't have answers, but she rested her head lightly against his arm. And that small gesture seemed to give him the courage to hope again. Elena watched quietly, humbled by the moment. When the girl began to tire, Elena prepared a pillow and tucked a blanket around her with soft, deliberate movements. The father watched with quiet reverence, his eyes following every tender motion. It was as though he were rediscovering what it meant to care, to nurture, to be present. Eleanor dimmed the lamp so the room glowed gently around them. And she felt her own exhaustion settle into her bones, but she also felt something rise, a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The father approached her then, speaking in a low voice so the girl wouldn't wake. He thanked her, not with the polished tone of a powerful man, but with the humility of someone who had been rescued from a quiet despair. He admitted he didn't understand how she had reached his daughter so quickly, so purely. Eleanor didn't know how to answer. She simply told him that kindness had a way of finding its own direction, and he nodded, as though learning a truth he should have known long ago. He stepped aside, motioning for her to join him near the living room table. There, he placed a small card on its surface, something official-looking but understated. Elena frowned slightly, confused by its presence. The man explained that he had made some calls earlier, desperate and unsure, hoping for guidance. And the card was the result of that impulsive plea. Elena picked it up with hesitant fingers, her eyes scanning the clean lettering, and her breath caught in her chest. It was an official notice, not legal, not punitive, but invitational, a formal acknowledgement of her actions, a request from a child welfare liaison, recognition of her bravery, a request to consider a more permanent role in the girl's healing. And the world seemed to shift beneath her feet. The next morning arrived slowly, the kind of winter dawn that drifts into the world like a soft apology. Elena opened her eyes to the quiet hum of the radiator and the faint glow slipping through her curtains. For a heartbeat, she wasn't sure if the night before had been real, the father's tears, the girl's trembling confession, the fragile bridge forming between them. Then she heard the delicate rustle of blankets from the living room, and reality settled around her like a warm, hesitant embrace. She stepped into the hallway and found the girl still asleep, curled gently against the pillow Elena had placed beneath her head. The child's breathing was steady now, no longer shallow with fear. The father had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, his posture slumped, his face softened by exhaustion and something like peace. Elena watched them both in the muted morning light, sensing the tender threads of healing beginning to weave through the air. And her heart ached with a mixture of relief and quiet wonder. She brewed coffee in the kitchen, letting its aroma seep slowly into the apartment, filling the corners that still held shadows of the previous night. The father stirred first, blinking into the light as though seeing the world with new eyes. He looked around uncertainly, as though expecting to wake alone in his own empty house. When his gaze landed on his daughter, still safe, still warm, his shoulders dropped with a grateful heaviness, and he whispered a soft thank you that barely reached the air. The girl woke next, stretching gently beneath the blanket, her eyes fluttering open with the innocence of someone experiencing safety after too long without it. When she saw her father, she gave him a small, tentative smile. It was a fragile thing, like a first step onto thawing ice. He returned it with such gentleness that Elena felt her throat tighten. Something inside him had cracked open during the night, letting the light seep in. And she wondered how long it had been since he had allowed himself to feel anything this honest. They shared breakfast together, a quiet ritual of warm toast and soft conversation. The girl leaned into her father's side as though testing whether he would remain if she touched him. He did. He wrapped an arm around her with a tenderness that felt new and unpracticed, yet deeply needed. Elena watched them from across the table, feeling a soft warmth spread through her chest. The broken pieces of their family weren't mended. Not yet. But they were no longer scattered. As the morning deepened, the father confessed gently that he wanted to change things, truly change them. Not through grand gestures or expensive solutions, but through presence, patience, and the work he had avoided for far too long. Elena saw the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability woven into his voice. He asked her if she believed people could rebuild trust once it had cracked. She thought for a moment, then nodded, telling him trust wasn't rebuilt in leaps, but in quiet, consistent steps, and he held onto that like a lifeline. The girl spent the next hour exploring Elena's small apartment, touching the spines of books, tracing the fringes of a white blanket, looking out the frosted window with a curiosity freer than the night before. Elena followed her with gentle watchfulness, noting each moment the girl relaxed, each smile that dared to emerge. The father watched too, his eyes softening every time the child laughed or pointed something out, and Elena sensed the faint warmth of hope blooming in him. The father approached Elena while the girl played quietly near the window. His voice was low, his gratitude earnest in a way that felt deeper than words. He told her that her kindness had opened a door he had been too afraid to approach. He admitted he didn't know how to move forward alone. Elena felt the weight of his sincerity settle gently on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as an invitation. And for the first time, the future didn't feel quite so heavy. There was a softness to the day now, a gentleness that wrapped itself around the three of them like winter sunlight. Elena realized she had gone from stranger to anchor in a single night, not by intention, but by instinct. Something inside her, long dormant, had awakened, a purpose she hadn't known she needed. The girl turned toward her suddenly, holding out a small snow globe Elena kept on the shelf. It shimmered with flakes suspended over a tiny house. And Elena realized how symbolic the moment felt. Then the father cleared his throat, his voice unsteady enough to make Elena turn. He reached into his coat pocket and held out a small, carefully wrapped package. Its paper white, its ribbon tied with deliberate care. He told her it was something he had picked up earlier that morning, something he had hoped she would accept. Elena stared at it, surprised, almost breathless. The child's eyes widened with anticipation, as though sensing its importance, and when Elena finally reached out to take it, she felt instinctively that whatever waited inside would change everything. Months passed with the gentle certainty of seasons rediscovering their rhythm, and winter slowly surrendered to the softer breath of spring. Elena found herself walking through the old neighborhood one quiet afternoon. The snow melted into glistening puddles along the sidewalk. She paused outside the cafe where everything had begun, watching the sun spill across the windows with a tenderness she had never noticed before. The door chimed inside as customers came and went, laughter weaving through the warm air. And she felt the strange comfort of seeing a place forever changed by a single night. She stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon, the same aroma that once wrapped around a trembling child on a storm-heavy evening. Her co-workers smiled, welcoming her back with warmth that had grown richer since her life had opened in unexpected ways. Elena walked to the booth, where she had once placed a steaming bowl into a pair of shaking hands. She rested her fingertips on the wooden edge, remembering the snow, the cold, the fear, the fragile hope, and she felt gratitude rise like a gentle tide. The bell above the door chimed again, and this time she turned to see the girl, now brighter, stronger, her cheeks full of color, pushing her wheelchair forward with practiced confidence. Her father followed just behind, carrying 2 small paper bags filled with pastries. He caught Elena's eye and offered a smile that held none of the tension it once did. Only sincerity, softened by humility and growth. And in that brief exchange, Elena saw the quiet miracle of change. They joined her at the table, folding warmly into a moment that felt as natural as breathing. The girl told her stories about school, about new friends, about the little things she loved rediscovering. Elena listened with a calm, steady joy, feeling the echo of that frightened child fade further into memory. The father watched them both, the kind of watching that came not from worry, but from pride. And Elena sensed the quiet bond that now threaded through their lives. After a while, the girl reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper, offering it to Elena with shy excitement. When she opened it, she found a drawing, the 3 of them standing beneath falling snow, the cafe glowing behind them like a lantern guiding them home. Elena felt her eyes warm with emotion as she traced the delicate pencil lines. She hadn't realized the moment meant so much to the child, but it had shaped them all. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, laughing, letting time stretch in the way it only does when hearts feel safe. Eleanor looked at the girl's father, noticing the subtle but undeniable changes in him. Lighter shoulders, gentler eyes, a man who had learned to listen. He spoke about attending every doctor visit, every school meeting, every bedtime story he had once missed. His voice carried quiet pride, and Eleanor knew he had grown into the father the girl always needed. When the sun dipped low, painting the cafe in amber hues, they stood to say goodbye. The girl hugged Elena tightly, her small arms wrapping around her with a trust that felt sacred. The father thanked her again, not out of obligation, but from a place of genuine reverence. Elena stepped outside with them, watching as they headed down the street together, their silhouettes framed by the final light of day. And she realized that some stories didn't end, they transformed. She walked home with the same calm glow inside her chest, thinking about the path that had led her here, the fear, the doubt, the heartbreak, the tenderness. It had woven itself into something whole, something meaningful. She understood now that kindness didn't just change someone else's life, it reshaped your own in quiet ways you never expected. And on that thought, she felt peace settle into her, like the closing of a gentle book. Later that night, sitting by her window as the sky turned lavender and soft, Elena reflected on the girl's laughter, on the father's gratitude, on the strange destiny that had walked through her door months ago. The world outside shimmered faintly, streetlights glowing like small promises in the dark. She held the drawing in her lap, tracing its edges with quiet affection. And she whispered a thank you to the storm, to the night, to the little girl who taught her that one moment of courage can change an entire life. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments, subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption, and don't forget to watch another story waiting for you right here on the final screen.